This episode of California Dreaming is brought to you by Blubrry. Blubrry offers the best media hosting, accurate listening stats, and their all-new PowerPress Deluxe sites. A no-setup WordPress website for your podcast with all of the necessary links to share your show with the world built right in. Head over to blubrry.com/dream to sign up for media hosting and a PowerPress Deluxe site and get your first month for free. That's blubrry.com/dream. Warning: this episode contains details of sexual violence as well as other graphic details that may not be suitable for some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Those of you who follow me on social media know that I recently took a short road trip with my family to the beautiful state of Arizona. It's become one of our favorite destinations to go for a quick visit to someplace different, to take in not only the amazing desert, but the magnificent natural wonders, and also the small towns and historic districts, and the different places to shop and eat. Those of you who live in areas where states are smaller and more clustered together, it might not be as big of a deal to go from one state to the next. But where we live here in Southern California, it's like a big deal when we cross borders. We're actually closer to Mexico than we are to any other state. So going to Arizona or Nevada, for us, is at least a 3 or 4 hour drive. And as for the other state that borders California, Oregon, that's no less than an 11-hour drive from where we're at. So, since I've been back, I've been thinking about an Arizona crime with a California connection that I could share with you guys. I mentioned the murder of Travis Alexander. I also mentioned that I wouldn't talk about that case because it's been talked about a lot. It's probably the most infamous California/Arizona crime out there right now. You guys remember that story, right? Jodi Arias. She drives herself like several thousand miles to slash up her ex-boyfriend in Mesa, Arizona, and did all that driving from where she lived in Northern California to Southern California to Mesa, where she got stabby, then to Salt Lake City, and then back to Northern California. Yeah, that was a fascinating trial. It's one of the few trials I've ever watched all the way through, but as I said, this story's been told many times. Maybe someday when some more years have passed, I might revisit that murder, but for right now, I'm going to leave it alone. Today, I have a story to tell you that begins here in Orange County, California, and ends in Prescott, Arizona. It's the story of a mysterious disappearance of a young Newport Beach woman whose case for 3 long years had grown cold, literally. In this 19th episode of California Dreaming, the tale of 2 states. I recently saw an article that had been making the rounds through social media, though it was a story a couple years old already. It was about a woman in the Chicago area who was being pulled over for speeding, but she didn't stop right away. When she sped past a cop clocking her speed at 54 miles per hour in a 35 mile per hour zone, he pulled behind her and activated his lights and sirens. The driver, however, did not want to pull over in that area. It was late at night, and it was dark, and she was alone. So she made the decision to continue driving for at least a mile or so until she found a Kohl's parking lot that she felt safe to pull over in. She had turned on her hazard lights, slowed down her car, rolled down her window, motioned to the officer, acknowledging his presence, but she continued driving until she found a place that she was safe pulling over at. She later explained that she was scared for her safety and that it was a very dark road and she wanted to get to a safe, well-lit place. When she finally stopped in that Kohl's parking lot, the officer approached her car and she could tell that he was visibly angry. He asked her what the hell she was doing and told her that he could arrest her for this. She said that she asked him not to curse at her, and she handed over her driver's license and registration. A few minutes later, the officer returned to her car. Some more words were apparently exchanged, and then the officer told her to stop talking and to get out of the car, and he placed her in handcuffs. The driver was taken into custody, booked into the county jail, and subsequently charged with 1 felony count of resisting arrest. Nothing more was said while they were in the squad car on the way to the county jail. She was able to bail herself out that evening. But this raises the question, what would you do if you were in this situation? If it were late and you were being pulled over by police, you're alone in your car, and the road is desolate and dark, would you make that decision to keep driving until you found a safer place to stop? I hadn't really ever thought of it before. It's actually been a long time since I've been pulled over for a traffic violation. But having heard this story, I think I might do the same thing and drive to a more well-lit area before pulling over. I might even try to make a phone call, maybe to my husband, to let him know that I'm being pulled over just in case he never hears from me again. But yeah, I'd firstly try to avoid getting pulled over, and secondly, just go ahead and find a safe place. And maybe police departments across the board should allow for this to be a thing, right? I mean, if someone gets pulled over in the HOV lane, we're not expected to stop right there in the travel lanes. We're to pull over to a safe place, maybe on the shoulder, or even possibly completely exit the freeway and find a parking lot to pull into. I don't see any reason why not to allow for the same standard for dark, desolate roadways, and not just for the safety of the driver, but for the officers as well. The thing is, sometimes things happen, suspicious things happen. We've heard stories about people being pulled over by not real cops, people posing as police officers or some sort of official with a light and a badge. These things have happened, although it's rare. It happens nonetheless. And I suppose it also depends on the cop. If you're lucky, you might just get that nice officer who's patient and understanding, that pulled you over because you were speeding and appreciates your concerns for your safety and lets you off with a warning. But maybe you get that cop that's just had a bad night. When he goes to pull you over for speeding and you don't stop when you're commanded to, it just pushes him over the edge. This police officer could have handled this differently, but ultimately it was up to him. Even when drivers are compliant, they can sometimes go off the deep end. Remember Philando Castile? There's a guy who seemingly did everything he was supposed to do, and it still got him shot to death. And not only that, the justice system said that it was okay for that to happen that way. And in case some of you listening haven't heard of Philando Castile, let me give you a quick summary. His story is worth mentioning and remembering. Philando was pulled over for a traffic violation in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, a suburb of St. Paul, by officers Geronimo Yanez and Joseph Kauser. In the car with Philando, who was driving, was his girlfriend Diamond Reynolds and her 4-year-old daughter, seated in the back. It's reported that officers over the radio stated that they were planning to pull Philando over and check the IDs of the driver and the passenger, because the 2 occupants looked like people who were involved in a robbery earlier that night. The stop took place at 9:05 p.m. Officer Yanez approached the car from the driver's side, Kauser on the passenger side. According to the dash cam video, 40 seconds passed between the time Yanez first started talking to Philando through the car window and the time that he began shooting at him. After Yanez asked Philando for his driver's license and proof of insurance, Philando gave him his proof of insurance card, which Yanez glanced at and tucked into his pocket. Philando then calmly told Yanez, "Sir, I have to tell you that I do have a firearm on me." Before Philando even completed his sentence, Yanez interrupted him and said, "Okay," and the officer immediately placed his hand on the holster of his own weapon and said, "Okay, don't reach for it then. Don't pull it out." Philando responded, "I'm not pulling it out," and Diamond also said, "He's not pulling it out." Yanez repeated, but with his voice raised, "Don't pull it out." He quickly pulled his own gun with his right hand and reached inside the driver's window with his left. Diamond screamed, "No." Yanez quickly removed his left arm from the car and fired 7 shots in rapid succession at Philando. Diamond yelled, "You've just killed my boyfriend," while Philando moaned and said, "I wasn't reaching for it." Diamond reiterated loudly, "He wasn't reaching for it." Yanez again screamed, "Don't pull it out." Diamond said he wasn't. Yanez yelled back, "Don't move," followed by an expletive. Of the 7 shots Officer Yanez fired, which were at point-blank range, 5 of them hit Philando, 2 of them piercing his heart. You can find several videos of the incident online. Diamond began a Facebook live stream right after the shooting. The images in that video are very graphic. You can also find the dash cam vantage point, as well as video from inside the squad car after Diamond was handcuffed and placed in the back seat with her 4-year-old daughter, who, by the way, is heard trying to comfort her mom and basically telling her to calm down or she's going to get shot too. It's pretty heart-wrenching if you haven't already seen it. Yanez was arrested and charged in the shooting, but almost a year later, he was acquitted on all charges. Anyway, back to our driver. The county sheriff where all this took place later stated that he understands the safety concerns and agrees that every law enforcement agency in the country should recommend similar actions. He also would suggest to call 911 and ask the dispatcher if the officer behind you is a legitimate cop. But if you don't have a cell phone, then yes, drive to a safer place. In the wake of this incident having drawn national attention, along with viral social media posts, the department has said it's the last thing that they want, considering the rising mistrust of police officers across the country, and that they've already taken the initiative in retraining all of the officers when dealing with issues such as this one. But he also defended his department, stating that it was this one lady who didn't trust the police in a fully marked Crown Victoria patrol car who chose not to pull over immediately. But where does it stop? That there's a bigger picture here, one much more troubling than this one isolated incident. He asks, should every motorist be allowed to disobey an officer's command to stop immediately? How far should a motorist be allowed to drive to feel safe? 1 mile? 5 miles? Only at night? Only on dark roads? Only women driving alone? By the letter of the law, motorists are supposed to pull over immediately. But we understand extenuating circumstances. Ultimately, the charges were dismissed against the motorist. The statement noting, at the time of the arrest, the officer had probable cause to support filing the criminal charges. Upon review of the circumstances of the incident, as well as information learned after the incident, it was determined that a dismissal of charges was in the best interest of justice. But she still got her speeding ticket. The reason why I'm talking about pulling over in safe places, if you can, and people posing as police officers is because It comes to play a little bit later on in this story. It's just a bit of a side note I wanted you to keep on the back burner for a bit while I get into today's tale. Denise Huber was a 23-year-old Newport Beach, California resident living with her parents. She had just graduated from college a year earlier. She had spent that past year working part-time as a waitress, as well as a second job at Bloomingdale's. She was sowing her oats, so to speak, enjoying life before she was ready to get serious about getting into a career and working full-time. Her friends and family described her as outgoing, adventurous, and fun-loving. Denise had a boyfriend at the time, Steve Horrocks. By all accounts, they were a good match for one another. They enjoyed each other's company and had a strong, loving relationship. So on June 2nd, 1991, the couple had tickets to go see Morrissey perform at the Great Western Forum in Inglewood, California, almost a 45-mile drive from Denise's Orange County home. Unfortunately, Steve was unable to get out of working that night. Denise was disappointed, but she was going to go to the concert anyway. She asked a friend of hers, Robert Calvert, to accompany her to the show instead, to which he agreed. She told her mom that she was going to be home pretty late. After the show, Denise and Robert made a pit stop at the El Paso Cantina in Torrance, California. While there, Denise happened to run into an old acquaintance, one who had previously had expressed a romantic interest in her in the past. So when he saw her at the cantina, he did ask if she wanted to hang out with him that evening, but she declined. She and Rob ended up leaving the cantina around 1 o'clock in the morning, and she dropped him off at his house. He would be the last known person to ever see Denise alive. When her parents woke to find that she wasn't home, they were somewhat concerned, but they didn't keep that watchful of an eye on her, as she had typically been a responsible person. She was 23 years old, and they had always had complete faith and trust in their daughter. But it wasn't like her to not show up or call or be out of touch for this long. She knew it would worry her parents. So her parents immediately began calling her friends and anyone who might have an idea of where Denise may have gone. One of the people they called first was her best friend from college, Tammy Brown, and she immediately became worried about Denise. She knew where she had gone the night before, and she knew who she was with, so she called Rob and asked if he knew where she was. He informed her that she dropped him off around 2 in the morning and he hadn't heard from her since. Knowing the route Denise would have taken to go from Rob's to her own house, Tammy drove around searching for Denise's car, a blue Honda Accord. Amazingly, at approximately 10 p.m. the night after Denise was last seen, Tammy spotted her car on the shoulder of the 73 Corona Del Mar freeway. In complete disbelief that she had actually found it, she immediately pulled over and hurried over to the vehicle, only to find nobody in it, with a flat tire and the hazard lights flashing. Tammy called Denise's parents, who quickly made their way to the scene to inspect the vehicle. It was unlocked, but Denise's keys were not inside. The flat tire on her car had left a skid mark on the freeway. The area seemed to be well lit, and there were several emergency call boxes visible nearby, and there was a chain link fence that bordered the freeway, but there was an opening that led down a gravel slope that was adjacent to a city street that was close to gas stations, restaurants, payphones, and a hotel. Don't forget that in 1991, cell phones weren't really a thing yet. It was sometime after midnight that night, almost a full 24 hours since Denise had left the cantina and dropped her friend off, when Costa Mesa, California detectives arrived at the scene of the abandoned vehicle. They quickly assessed the situation, but there were little clues as to what happened to Denise. There didn't seem to be anything amiss inside the car. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood. Everything appeared to be in order on the interior of the vehicle. Her shoes and purse were gone, and the hazard lights were on, which led investigators to think that she did make her way out of the vehicle on her own. But then what? Search dogs picked up her scent on the shoulder of the freeway, but then lost it. They didn't feel Denise had been involved in any high-risk activities, but she had seemingly disappeared without a trace, and all they had was Denise's empty car. Because there were call boxes, nearby payphones, and easy access off the freeway, detectives did feel strongly that a crime had been committed that caused Denise to vanish. They just didn't have much evidence to be found at the crime scene to indicate what had happened to her. Police canvassed the businesses and neighborhoods nearby, but nobody had seen Denise. Helicopters were brought in to do a search of the area for her. Less than 3 miles away from where Denise's car was found abandoned, her parents were able to hear the helicopter search from their home. Frustrated and worried that she was so close by, wondering what the helicopters could find, knowing that they were likely looking for a body. The search went on for days. They exhausted all means of searching for her, but no trace of Denise was found. No article of clothing, no discarded purse, nothing. No indication if she were alive or dead. Just nothing. She seemingly pulled over to the side of the road and vanished off the face of the earth. Detectives never really received any viable leads or clues that gave them any information as to Denise's whereabouts. The car was brought into the police lab for processing. The interior revealed no unknown fingerprints. The flat tire revealed that it had not been tampered with or purposely flattened. The physical evidence led investigators to nothing but dead ends. They turned to interviewing the last known people to have interacted with Denise. They talked to Rob, the friend she attended the Morrissey concert with, the one who went with her when her boyfriend wasn't able to go. Detectives wondered if he had maybe had an infatuation or an attraction to Denise. Could he have been made upset because there was no romantic interest in him on her part? It's possible. They also looked at Denise's actual boyfriend, Steve, but both Rob and Steve were cooperative and were able to provide solid alibis for their whereabouts at the time it's estimated that Denise went missing. Detectives also tracked down the acquaintance Denise had run into at the El Paso cantina, but he too had a solid alibi that proved pretty conclusively that he hadn't followed her or anything after leaving the cantina. Detectives even looked at the possibility that Denise had taken off on her own. Maybe she had another boyfriend that she ran off with without telling anyone. But that too was a dead end. Denise's parents, obviously desperate for information, turned to the media to spread the word about her disappearance. They wanted to get her picture out there, get her face on the newspapers and on television reports. They offered a reward for any information leading to her recovery. They made buttons, they made bumper stickers, they made flyers. They hung a large banner on a building adjacent to the freeway where her car was found. The community really came together and rallied behind Denise's family in hopes of finding out what happened to her. But the case quickly grew cold. Absolutely nothing worthwhile was coming in. The detectives had no clues. It was just baffling. And as it would turn out, Denise Huber would never be heard from again. So, fast forward 3 years to 1994, and more than 300 miles and one state away in Yavapai County, Arizona. Jack and Elaine Court, residents of the area, headed over to the Prescott Country Club. In the mid-afternoon of July 9th, 1994, they were there to purchase paint supplies from an independent paint contractor named John Famalaro. People who have worked with him would describe Famalaro as a different kind of awkward person. He comes off as dodgy, evasive, and somewhat disingenuous. He told the courts that he was a longtime paint supplier and contractor, and that he had moved to Arizona from California about 6 months earlier. As Elaine and Jack chatted with Famalaro, aside from the weird vibes that they were getting from the guy, they noticed a Ryder brand moving truck parked in his driveway. The couple immediately grew suspicious of the 24-foot moving truck with California plates. They could tell that it had been parked there for a long time. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, and grass and weeds had overgrown around the tires. The courts decided that there was just something too weird about Famalaro, along with this weird truck, so they decided they weren't going to let this go. And it just so happens that they had a friend who is a police officer out of Phoenix. And it just so happened that that officer was in charge of stolen vehicles. So when they left, they decided to jot down the truck's information, and they turned that over to their officer friend. He ran the plates and the Ryder truck's numbers through their missing and stolen vehicle search system, and they got a hit on the truck having been stolen out of California. A few days later, on July 13th, Yavapai County Sheriff deputies arrived at the Famalaro home with a search warrant to talk to him about the stolen truck. But nobody was home at the time, so the detective made his way over to the Ryder truck that was backed into the driveway. He examined the back of the truck, which was locked with a very small but very secure, very difficult to break into or cut lock. Coming out from under the roll-up door of the truck was a red extension cord, which was plugged into the house. Whatever was in the truck, it seemed to need to be plugged in and running 24 hours a day. The deputy had seen enough similar situations throughout his career, particularly in his time on the narcotics detail, to recognize what he suspected might be a mobile methamphetamine lab, which apparently is a pretty common thing. This makes sense, I guess. I mean, what else would need to be plugged in to the back of a moving truck if it isn't something nefarious, right? So the deputy called for a narcotics task force to arrive at the scene, and they were in the driveway within the hour. One of the members of the task force pulled open the back door of the truck, but there was no meth lab inside this truck. Instead, the extension cord was plugged in to a large industrial freezer. When detectives open the freezer door, they find the contents to be a large black garbage bag with something inside that was frozen solid. One of the detectives carefully ran his hand down the side of the bag and felt what he believed to be an arm of a human being, frozen solid. In a matter of 2 hours, this Ryder truck had gone from a simple stolen vehicle to a possible meth lab to this, a frozen dead body in the back of the truck. Homicide detectives quickly converged on the scene to investigate this still unidentified mass frozen inside some black plastic bags. Video cameras were rolling as they opened the freezer to prepare to carefully cut open the plastic bags to reveal what exactly was inside. It's immediately apparent that along with this mysterious bag, there is a strong smell of decomposition emanating from the freezer. The detective cut through not one, not two, but 3 layers of garbage bags before getting a glimpse of what was inside. As soon as they peeled back the final layer, it was obvious the bag contained the remains of a human body. Right away, detectives could see this person, frozen. They saw an arm and a thigh, and they could see the arms handcuffed together behind the back. The handcuffs really left no doubt that the detectives had a murder on their hands. They decided to seal the freezer back up and send it and its contents over to the Maricopa County lab for analysis. Just before the freezer is taken away, their newly uncovered homicide suspect, John Famalaro, happens to pull up into his driveway. They immediately take him into custody and bring him over to the sheriff's department for questioning about the situation in his driveway. Sitting across from the 37-year-old suspect, the detective conducting the interrogation had decided it was going to be his strategy to keep it calm, just to get a feel for this guy's overall demeanor. The detective knows that Famalaro is a very reclusive individual and that he's never been arrested before. But he also knows that this is the guy seated across from him that has a frozen body sitting in his driveway. He told Famalaro that there's a very serious problem with the stolen truck, with a freezer, with a body in it. But Famalaro said nothing and immediately requested a lawyer. Other than that, Famalaro remained silent, refusing to speak another word to detectives. So he has Famalaro booked on suspicion of grand theft auto and returns to the crime scene, hoping to find any information as to the identity of the person in the freezer since Famalaro wasn't talking. He wanted to know who she was and how she ended up frozen inside this stolen rental truck. The next day, a team of no less than a dozen Yavapai County deputies, armed with a search warrant, entered Famalaro's home. What they see before them would become an incredibly daunting task for detectives. Every single inch of this home, the living room, the bedrooms, the garage, everything was completely covered floor to ceiling with cardboard boxes full of stuff. Aside from being a weirdo and a possible killer, Famalaro is also a hoarder. As it turns out, he is a man who never, ever, ever threw anything away. And police were tasked with having to go through all of his stuff. Boxes upon boxes of stuff. If they were going to find any kind of evidence to tell them who this woman in the freezer was. When everything was said and done, investigators took and examined over 100,000 items from Famalaro's home. When they entered the bedroom, investigators did find some implements of violence. They uncovered several weapons, including a Colt revolver, a sledgehammer, a shotgun, a pair of handcuffs, and 2 large knives. Amongst all of the cardboard boxes, detectives find in one labeled Christmas that contained a hammer and a nail puller. Both items appeared to be speckled with what looks like blood. These 2 items, along with thousands and thousands of other pieces of evidence, are all carted back to the sheriff's office for processing. As Famalaro is quietly waiting in an interrogation room, 2 doors down, the items brought over from his home are being picked through one by detectives. They managed to isolate approximately 5 boxes of evidence that seemed to be of particular interest. The first 4 boxes contained items that belonged to a woman, including underwear, a small black handbag, black high-heel shoes, and the shoes had some serious scuff marks on the back of them. In a white plastic bag, they discovered more women's clothing that appeared to be stained with dried blood. Scuffed shoes and blood-stained clothes. It was all adding up to an abduction and murder in the minds of the detectives. Also in the box were a blood-stained pair of men's jeans, a blood-stained sweatshirt, dried blood-soaked rags, a pair of surgical gloves turned inside out, and an empty handcuffs box, duct tape, a gray tarp covered in blood, and garbage bags similar to the ones found in the freezer. Also found amongst all of these belongings was a receipt for a freezer, purchased from an appliance dealer out of Laguna Hills, California, delivered to a warehouse dated July 10th, 1991. But who was this victim? Who do these things belong to? The answer, as it turns out, would be in the fifth and final box that were of interest. It contained a woman's wallet, the credit cards, driver's license, a checkbook, and all other cards bearing the same name, Denise Annette Huber. Detectives were fairly certain now as to the identity of the woman in the freezer, and with that, they had enough probable cause to book Famalaro for homicide. The freezer and its contents had been sent to the Maricopa County Coroner's Office. The medical examiner was tasked with examining the body, collecting evidence, conducting the autopsy, identifying the victim, but first, the body needed to be defrosted. It was immediately evident to the medical examiner that the body was female. She had some jewelry associated with being female, as well as long fingernails. The coroner immediately began this examination with the fact that she was naked and had on handcuffs. Therefore, this pointed to a homicide event. So they needed to keep that in mind when looking for how this victim was killed. The most complicated aspect of examining this particular victim was the fact that this body was frozen. On any given day at the Maricopa Medical Examiner's Office, the coroner will examine an average of 3 bodies. This frozen victim was a very atypical situation, especially in this part of the United States. It is very hot in Arizona, and medical examiners nearly exclusively deal with people who have died and rapidly decomposed due to exposure to heat. So this frozen body was new for their office to deal with. The first thing the coroner wanted to do was identify the body. What makes this even more complicated is that as soon as the body would begin to thaw, it would rapidly decompose, as it will literally start falling apart. This is going to sound pretty graphic, but I think if you've listened to Serial, you've heard of this phenomenon. When the body thaws, the outer skin will begin to separate from the inner tissues, which is referred to as sloughing. They decided to use a regular hair dryer to begin to thaw the victim's hands in a manner in which fingerprints could be obtained before they are destroyed. They were able to roll her fingerprints and make a positive match to the fingerprint stamp on the driver's license found in Famalaro's home. This was indeed Denise Huber. The coroner also wanted to make sure to swab specific areas of Denise's body as she was thawing out. So they were looking for any kind of forensic evidence related to a sexual assault. But the evidence also needed to be collected quickly, as the more she thawed, the more the outer layers of her skin were deteriorating. Several samples were taken from different places on Denise's body and put into jars for testing. When those fluid samples were finally examined, there were indeed sperm cells present on Denise's body. Even after being frozen for 3 years, the medical examiner was amazed that these were still present for analysis. So, with the frozen body finally identified as Denise, it was soon determined that this was a missing woman out of Orange County, California, and this information leads Arizona detectives to California and to a missing persons case that had been cold for 3 years. They needed to know, how did Denise, having gone missing 3 years earlier, resurface more than 300 miles away in Arizona? The lead detective in Denise's case in Orange County was keeping up with some busy work when he finally got the call he had been waiting for all those years. When Yavapai County detectives called him, he had never even heard of Yavapai before. They told him they thought they had Denise Huber, and they asked him if he knew who she was. As the lead detective would describe it, the hair stood up on the back of his neck. By the 15th of July, detectives from both Arizona and California began to build their murder case against John Famalaro. But there were a couple of things that needed to be figured out. Firstly was, how did Denise die? And secondly was, where did she die? Establishing where Denise was killed was important in order to establish which jurisdiction would try the murder case against Famalaro. It was ascertained during the autopsy that Denise's skull was completely bashed in, and the medical examiner determined that the cause of death was blunt force trauma of the skull. When she was removed from the black garbage bags, they discovered that her head was wrapped in a white plastic bag, which had several puncture marks all over it, as if someone had wrapped this bag over her head prior to striking her about the head. When that bag was removed during the defrosting process, they found her mouth and nose had been covered with duct tape. A forensic anthropologist was given the task to painstakingly reconstruct the skull in order to further analyze the wound patterns. Denise's skull had literally been bashed into hundreds of tiny pieces. It was clear that there were 2 different wound patterns about Denise's skull once it was put back together, indicating that 2 different weapons were used in bludgeoning her. It would later be determined that the weapons used to strike Denise were indeed the hammer and the nail puller that they found amongst Famalaro's belongings, and the DNA of the blood on those items were a match to Denise's DNA. Those implements also matched the indentations in her skull. The medical examiner also found that there were small pieces of plastic stuck in those fractures, which indicated that the bags were indeed put over her head before those blows were struck. It was further determined that Denise was hit a total of 31 times. It would also later be determined that the DNA found on Denise's body, as well as some semen stains found on her clothing that was located amongst Famalaro's belongings, matched his DNA. So how did this guy pull this off? How did Denise wind up missing from California and end up dead in Arizona in a freezer in Famalaro's driveway? Well, investigators discovered that at the time Denise disappeared, Famalaro was actually working in Newport Beach. He had rented a warehouse in the area for his painting business. It's worth noting at this point that this warehouse is the very same place that the freezer had been delivered to back in 1991, a few days after Denise had been reported missing. Investigators talked to the people who rented the warehouse after Famalaro, and they pointed detectives to an area in the corner of the warehouse where they had found a large brown stain that they washed out with a hose. Investigators had a feeling that that brown stain was blood, so they returned to that warehouse at night and treated the area with luminol, which, under alternative light, fluoresced the bloodstains. And it's probably no surprise that the DNA from those bloodstains in that warehouse were a match to Denise Huber. Another very important piece of evidence was a receipt investigators found amongst Famalaro's things. That receipt that I had told you about earlier, showing that the freezer had been ordered on June 10th, 1991, and it was delivered the very next day to that very warehouse where her blood was found. So with that, police determined Famalaro killed Denise in California. I wanted to circle back for a moment to what we had talked about at the beginning of this episode, about being pulled over by police. Among the thousands of things that investigators found in Famalaro's home, they also found some look-alike Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy uniforms. There was a time when Famalaro wanted to be a police officer, and for a brief time, he was enrolled in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Training Academy for Reserve Officers. He made several attempts in 1983 and 1984 to become a police officer, a sheriff's deputy, or a reserve officer, but either was rejected or dropped out early in the application process. The closest he ever got was 4 months that he spent as a reserve deputy. He began the 6-month training program in November of 1983, but dropped out in March of 1984. Prior to that, he had applied to being a reserve deputy with the Orange County Sheriff's Department, but after submitting his application in May of 1983, he dropped out of the application process. They simply didn't hear from him anymore after he had applied, so he was dropped. But a year later, a couple of months after dropping out of the Los Angeles Academy, Famalaro again applied for a position in Orange County, but this time as a full-fledged deputy. But in June of 1984, he was not selected for whatever reason. That same year, he applied to be an officer with the Irvine Police Department, but again dropped out early in the process. And as for the uniforms, officials say that it isn't difficult for someone to buy them. Anyone can buy a pair of pants and a shirt if they want to. But it's when people start to try and affix official department patches to them that poses a problem. The uniforms found in Famalaro's home reportedly had replica Los Angeles Sheriff's patches sewn onto them. So that being said, there was a theory as to how Famalaro was able to approach Denise on that roadside without having her immediately growing suspicious. After Denise had dropped her friend off in Huntington Beach, she was making her way home to nearby Newport Beach when her tire blew out on the freeway. And as bad luck would have it, it just so happened that Famalaro encountered Denise broken down on the shoulder of that freeway and pulled over, presumably to provide assistance. Is it possible that Famalaro was trolling the streets and the freeways that night? Could he have been wearing this fake police uniform in order to easily gain the trust of potential victims? We may never know if that's what he did or not, because he has never spoken about it. But the theory had been floated once these uniforms were found. Either way, it ended badly for Denise regardless. However, it does serve as that cautionary tale, the one that led that woman who refused to stop when being pulled over by police until she arrived at a safer, more well-lit area. Stories like Denise's are the ones that cause us to be so suspicious. And I don't mean to go off track again, but that's what I seem to like to do apparently. So this story of Denise breaking down on the freeway and succumbing to the bad luck of having crossed paths with a bad guy, what are the chances? What does this story remind you of? If you're thinking what I'm thinking, then you're thinking Maura Murray. I can't tell you how many times over the last couple years I've heard the talking heads go back and forth about what are the chances that Maura crashed her car on that highway in the White Mountains just at the perfect time for a bad guy killer to cross paths with her and take her away forever. Case in point, Denise Huber. What are the chances? Of all the stretches of freeway in California, with nearly 400,000 miles or 643,000 kilometers of freeway throughout the state, for Denise to break down at 2 in the morning and for that one guy with bad intentions to cross paths with her. The chances feel astronomical, but it happened. And it could have happened to Maura Murray, too. I kind of used to blow off that theory in Maura's case, but not so much anymore after reading up on Denise's case. Even the tracking dogs did the same exact thing in the search for Denise that they did in Maura's. They tracked their scents for a short distance, then lost it. Also, in both cases, nobody saw anything. But we know what happened to Denise. She was attacked, abducted, and killed by Famalaro. The same thing could have happened to Maura. Anyway, I don't want to beat the Maura Murray disappearance to death any more than it already has been, but Denise's case has kind of changed my opinion on the bad guy theory. And that's just some food for thought for you guys. So, back to Famalaro. The guys actually never uttered a word about Denise's murder. Not a word. When indicted on the charges of capital murder, and the reason why the charges against him rose to the level of being a capital case is because the murder was committed while he was engaged in the crime of kidnapping. And in California, if a murder is committed during the commission of another felony, such as a robbery or a carjacking, or in this case, a kidnapping, that automatically makes the defendant eligible for the death penalty. Famalaro pleaded not guilty, though he would continue to remain silent all the way through his 1997 trial. Investigators were able to build their case against him using the forensic evidence they were able to uncover during their painstaking investigation into Denise's murder. The body, the freezer, the mountains and mountains of junk that they had to sort through in Famalaro's home and garage, the warehouse in Orange County, the blood evidence, the blood-stained clothing, the blood evidence on the murder weapons. Everything that they found, they were able to tie to him and him to Denise's murder. Based on what the forensic evidence told detectives, this is what they theorized had happened. After Denise dropped her friend off in Huntington Beach, her tire went flat on the 73 Corona Del Mar freeway. She was encountered by Famalaro very shortly thereafter, as she never utilized either of the call boxes that were stationed nearby along the shoulder of the freeway. It has been speculated, but could never really be confirmed, that he may have been wearing a replica sheriff's uniform in order to gain the trust of any potential victims he may have been out trolling for that night, or he simply pulled over and offered to help her change her tire. She seemingly voluntarily exited her car as her hazard lights were flashing and she had taken her purse and keys with her. At some point after she was out of her car, Famalaro overpowered her and incapacitated her in some way, as the scuff marks found on the back of her heels 3 years later indicated that she was dragged along a rough surface, such as highway asphalt. The forensic evidence indicated that Denise bled profusely inside that corner of the nearby warehouse Famalaro had rented to store his paint supplies, as investigators were able to illuminate blood evidence in that warehouse 3 years later, and DNA testing proved that it was indeed Denise's blood. It is also at this warehouse that investigators surmised he sexually assaulted Denise and then subsequently killed her by bashing her about the head 31 times. He had placed those plastic bags over her head, but she still bled profusely, leaving all that evidence behind. A few days after Denise's abduction, Famalaro purchased a freezer from an appliance dealer in nearby Laguna Hills and had that freezer delivered to his warehouse. He wrapped Denise's body in 3 layers of garbage bags and concealed her in that freezer, in the warehouse, until he moved to Arizona where his parents resided in the summer of 1992. He rented the Ryder truck, packed up his belongings, along with the freezer that entombed Denise's frozen body, and moved into a home adjacent to his parents' home. He parked that Ryder truck in his driveway, which was obviously supposed to be returned, but he never did, and was subsequently reported stolen. He ran a power cord to the freezer in order to keep Denise frozen until that Ryder truck was reported to that Phoenix police officer by vigilant citizens Jack and Elaine Court. And that's when detectives uncovered Denise's body, answering that 3-year-old question her family and Orange County detectives had been wondering. What happened to Denise Huber? As I said, Famalaro did not testify in his own defense. However, his attorneys did call more than 20 witnesses to testify on his behalf. I know what you're thinking. Where in the world did they find 20 people to speak in defense of this scumbag, right? I have no idea either. They called his mother, his brother, a sister, a niece, neighbors, and classmates from his childhood. They called a woman whom he helped save from a knife-wielding attacker one time. They called people who had worked with him in the past. They called his priest. They were called to help provide details about Famalaro's childhood and adult life. Famalaro was born June 10, 1957, to Anne and Angelo Famalaro in Long Island, New York, and was the youngest of 3 children. When he was a year old, they moved to Santa Ana, California. His father, an Air Force veteran, was a businessman, and his mother, a stay-at-home mom, was described as the dominant force in the home, incredibly temperamental and verbally abusive. The children apparently had a loving relationship with their father, but had a difficult and erratic relationship with their mother, who frequently invoked religion to justify her behavior and to control and intimidate everyone. She often told them that they were all going to hell, as they tried to follow their father's lead by giving in to all of her demands in order to avoid confrontations with her. She was described as painfully controlling, from everything to what they wore, what classes they took. She would search through their belongings and eavesdrop on their phone calls. She alienated the family from friends and neighbors because of her behaviors, her busybodiness, and her constantly being a killjoy. Children never came to their home. They rarely interacted with neighbors in social settings, but they went to church religiously. The outside of the home and the yard was always neat, but the inside was a horrendous mess, as Famalaro's mother was a hoarder, and on top of that, she was terribly paranoid of a possible communist invasion. Therefore, she hoarded food and supplies for survival as well. As a child, Famalaro was described as weak and often sick, and relentlessly bullied at school. He was described as withdrawn and a loner, but never violent as a child. He would have severe mood swings and go from hyperactive to depressed. He had a nervous twitch, and he seemed to be obsessed with ritualistic behaviors and symmetry. His quirky behavior and inability to sit still had him constantly in trouble at home and at school. He received little attention at home, as his mother was focused on his older brother, who excelled in school and was very personable and outgoing. His older sister grew to become very protective of Famalaro because of all of these issues he was dealing with when growing up. Famalaro was subjected to physical punishment from his mother, and it's reported she bathed the kids well into their preteens, paying special attention to scrubbing their genitals, telling them that they were special areas that needed to be cleaned correctly, to the point that it was hugely inappropriate. She was obsessed with making sure the children did not engage in sexual activity and were not exposed to anything sexual. She did not allow them to take sex education classes, and she did not allow them to see anything on TV or in the movies that was more intimate than hand-holding. She would enter the boys' room often to ensure they were not masturbating. They were not allowed to date at all during their teen years. Famalaro's sister recounted an occasion when their brother was attending college. Their mom secretly followed him and his girlfriend to a motel room, and using a ruse, she barged into their room and confronted the couple. She screamed at his girlfriend and slapped her in the face, attacked her and started choking her. She managed to break free, but she was eventually convinced to not press charges. Famalaro was sent to seminary with the hopes that religion would rub off on him. After he graduated, he went to a Catholic college, where he met his first girlfriend, with whom he had an on-again, off-again relationship for 3 years. During their relationship, she had had an abortion, but towards the end, she got pregnant again. Famalaro proposed marriage, but she said no and gave the child up for adoption and moved away, purportedly because she was afraid of Famalaro's mom's behavior. These events apparently further traumatized Famalaro. It was around this time his mother became involved in local politics, campaigning against abortion, pornography, as well as the local adult theater. She ran for a seat on the Santa Ana City Council, but on the very same day that she announced her candidacy, Famalaro's brother was arrested for sexually molesting one 10-year-old girl, one 10-year-old boy, and having unlawful intercourse with a 17-year-old girl. This immediately ended her political campaign. His brother was convicted and committed to Patton State Hospital as a mentally disordered sex offender. In order to get away from this embarrassment, Famalaro's parents moved to Prescott, Arizona. Over the next several years, Famalaro attended college on and off again, but was never really able to finish anything he ever started, kind of like the sheriff's training I had talked about earlier. He was still living in California, staying with his grandmother, who was also a hoarder. I guess it runs in the family. His grandmother, because of health issues, eventually moved to Arizona as well to be taken care of by Famalaro's parents. But he stayed in California, eventually getting into the house painting business and running it out of that warehouse in Newport Beach. He embarked on several relationships, some of whom described him as fun, intelligent, nice, respectful, considerate, and polite, but they would also describe him as secretive and manipulative. 1 week before Denise's abduction and murder, Famalaro made a 42-minute phone call to an Orange County suicide hotline. 1 year later, he moved to Arizona because of his father's failing health. 2 years later, he'd be arrested for Denise's murder. And all I have to say about Famalaro's sob story is boo-hoo. Plenty of people have tough childhoods and difficult parents. Not everybody goes around raping and murdering. And it seems his jury had just about the same sentiment when it came to his childhood tales of woe, because it took them less than 3 hours to find him guilty of capital murder. On September 15th, 1997, Famalaro was sentenced to death. And true to form in California, he is still sitting on death row today, 26 years after he took Denise's life. Denise's parents, Ione and Dennis Huber, were able to speak at Famalaro's sentencing. They described their lives as turned upside down by their daughter's sudden disappearance. Words alone could not describe the 3 years of not knowing, followed by the grief after learning she was dead. Ione was frantic when Denise failed to come home that night. Then finding Denise's car, she described it as though somebody had kicked her in the stomach. She couldn't sleep or eat for days. They sent flyers to businesses and newspapers across the country, and they did several television interviews. She described how difficult it was going back to work, how hard the holidays were because Denise wasn't there. Ione talked about how much she missed doing the things her and Denise used to do together. Lunch dates, going to the beach, hanging out by the pool, cooking together. She described her daughter as sensitive, caring, and compassionate, and a person who brought great joy to their lives. Her father talked about how much he missed the Friday morning breakfast that he used to have with Denise every week. He said that she was a happy person and had the ability to cheer him up, even on his worst days. A couple of days before she disappeared, she had left a note on his computer screen, signed with a happy face that said, "Hi Dad, I love you. Have a great day. Love, Denise." He said he would not trade that piece of paper for $1 million. Last year marked the 25th anniversary of Denise's death. In an interview her parents gave last year, her father stated that it's likely Famalaro would die of old age in prison before he gets the death penalty. He also said that both he and his wife would probably die before he does. At that point, the Hubers had been married for 52 years, and they said they've made peace with the fact that Famalaro may never be dealt the death sentence he was given. They're just kind of done with it, and it's up to the state of California to deal with him. Dennis and Ione are now living out their retirement along the banks of the Missouri River in South Dakota. And there is not a day that goes by that they don't think of Denise. And that brings this 19th episode of California Dreaming to a close. I have so many thank yous to get to, but before I do that, I have a couple of promos that I want to play for you. Some podcasts that I've discovered, and I think you might enjoy. Here, take a listen.
Do you like true crime, mysteries, urban legends, or just weird stuff in general? If the answer is yes, I highly encourage you to try out my new podcast, the Asian Madness Podcast, where I cover all of the topics mentioned above from the Asian continent. Podcast is now available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and most other podcast apps.
Hey, Katie.
Hey Gussie.
Do you want to tell people about our podcast?
Oh my gosh, I've been waiting all day to tell people about our podcast.
What's it called?
It's called Married to Murder.
What's it about?
It's couples who murder each other or murder together.
Oh my god, that sounds so awesome.
It's
Where can you
fascinating.
listen to it?
iTunes or anywhere podcasts are available.
Anywhere a podcast is available?
Anywhere.
Get out. I can't wait to go listen myself.
Well, hurry up. I'll time you.
Okay.
Well, hello, my friends. This is CK from the Mirths and Monsters podcast, proud partner of the Odd Audio Network. Join me, my companion Finn, and my occasionally satanically possessed cat Ray as we investigate the real truths behind some of the most wonderful creatures you can imagine. Are trolls really that thick? Or is it just bad press? Are leprechauns really drunken bums? Sort of. But there's a lot more to find out. All you need to do is tune in to Mirths and Monsters podcast with me and Finn. Till next time, sláinte. Your good health.
I need to give a big shout out to those who have been the latest to jump in on supporting California Dreaming on Patreon. I'm so grateful for all of your generosity in helping me to grow this little show. I've posted several Patreon episodes, and I'm still trying to figure out the best ways I can give back to those who've pledged support. I did add tier levels, mainly because I was having fun creating the names for the different levels, but I'm not quite sure yet what it means in terms of tier rewards. But if you're going to donate at the highest level, hit me up on social media and we'll talk about what we can do. And if you have left me a review on iTunes or anywhere else, thank you to you as well, and especially if it's a good review. I'm always going to be giving out show stickers, so be sure to email me for more information at californiapod@yahoo.com. Follow me on all the social media. Join the discussion page on Facebook. This week I was looking for some cursed TV shows and movies. I got a lot of really great suggestions. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and on Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. Feel free to post or tweet at me about anything California, crime, pets, babies, kids, families, cooking, gifts, and memes. Tag me in everything. California Dreaming is also now a part of the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We have joined forces with an amazing group of podcasts from a variety of genres, such as The Concession Stand, where hosts Nick and Andy geek out over all things entertainment, or Super Nerds UK, where hosts Ben, Ian, Tim, and Simon take an irreverent look at pop culture, or Busted Wide Open, a show where Nick and Sir Ian Dangerous take you on a weekly journey through the hottest news in sports entertainment, or Historium, a podcast devoted to the strange, obscure, or otherwise interesting stories from history, or Is This Adulting, where best friends Stephen and Chris break down the stigma on mental illness through the lens of comedy, or the Dirty Bits podcast. Join host Tawny Plattis for our casual retellings of the sexy, scandalous, and salacious stories your history teacher likely left out. Or 401 Owned, a show where hosts GT, Jack, Kevin, Jack, and Matt fill your ear holes with all things gaming. And lastly, but certainly not least, I'm super excited to announce the newest addition to our little pod family, the Film Roast podcast, a show where underqualified and over-caffeinated hosts Hannah and Julia talk about all things movies. If any of these shows sounds like they might pique your interest, visit www.orbitaljigsaw.com and click on their links. And don't forget to visit the Orbital Jigsaw family of podcast merchandise store, where you can get all sorts of California Dreaming stuff. T-shirts, hoodies, phone cases, stickers, mugs, and notebooks. You can support me and your other favorite creators by visiting the Orbital Jigsaw store. And as always, I will post a link in the show notes and on social media. Thank you again so much for joining me for this 19th episode of California Dreaming. And until next time, sweet dreams.